There are some definitions of architecture which give some sort of an insight into what the whole thing is about, but there aren't very many. I'm going to talk about one or two of the more popular ones, and then I'm going to make a proposal of my own. So in ancient times, the arrangement of structures was very often to do with ideas about God or related ideas about the nature of the cosmos or the heavens. But frequently these buildings were to do with external form. There wasn't very much said about internal space, at least not at the start, although that changes a little bit when we get to the Greeks and they start building theatres. By the time we get to ancient Rome, Vitruvius tells us that in order for a building to be considered a work of architecture, it must have stability, utility, and beauty, which nobody's going to really argue with, but I don't know if that's advanced our understanding of architecture very much, really. Many architects over the years have suggested that beautiful architecture is related to pure geometry or mathematical proportion. Similarly, the beauty of architecture is sometimes seen as a product of perfection of geometric form. This is something we see in the Pantheon, for example. And then we see it in the Enlightenment period with the work of Ledoux and Boulez. And then, of course, more recently with architects inspired by Le Corbusier. Some architects have proposed that architecture is about truth to materials. So this was perhaps part of the story of the development of the Gothic cathedrals, where it was believed that the stonemasons of the Gothic period were working stone which was in some way inherently true to its nature. And this is where the beauty of the building comes from. And in the 20th century, the theme is picked up by architects like Kahn and also by somebody like Alvar Aalto. There is a related strand in architecture that we refer to as tectonic. And this is the idea that beautiful architecture comes from beautiful assembly. And in the 20th century and the early 21st century, architects like Renzo Piano have championed this idea somewhat. One strand of 20th century modernism was very concerned with expressing the spirit of the time. And for some of these modernists, ironically, this meant being inspired by an idea of the future. Now, this was a very serious exploration for architects in the middle of the 20th century, but I think it's fair to say that by the time we got into the 21st century, futurism, this idea of reaching into the future, was becoming a little bit more glib. When architecture, to my mind, is at its most interesting, we see architects concerning themselves with the nature of space itself, how it is experienced by the individual. And we find it in buildings as different from one another as the Barcelona Pavilion and the Laurentian Library. It seems to me that all of these aspirations for architecture, which various architects have had over the years, are true, or at least partly true, but no single one of them actually answers the question of what is architecture. It seems to me that the architecture is the sum of all of these things plus something else, and I think it's the something else is where things get a bit interesting. For me, architecture is about ritual. So I'm going to suggest a definition of architecture, which is the following. Architecture is the presentation of its constituents, that is to say, matter, colour, light, touch, smell, sensory constituents, to create a coherent assembly for the purposes of facilitating ritual. Now, ritual and use are not the same thing. Any space can be used to eat, but a restaurant is a space where the ritual of dining occurs. The house may be the place which provides shelter from the elements. I think it's more accurate to say that it's the coherent environment within which the ritual of life plays out. But above all, it's not a machine for living in, which is a really wrong-headed idea. This doesn't mean that there can only be one type of house. The ritual of living can be accommodated in various interpretations. So this would be an Irish thatch or vernacular structure. And we've arrived at a very pleasing type of house in Indonesia and, of course, in Japan. I'm not really just limited to vernacular examples. For me, the Roby house, I think, is a very successful house, as is, for other reasons, the Stahl house. The Stahl house has, in its understanding of the ritual of life, the notion of dream. Books can be stored pretty much anywhere, but the library is the space for the discovery of knowledge. We all know a lot about the place of worship. I mean, the place of worship is, by definition, of course, the place where ritual plays out. I think pavilions are interesting ones. I think they are expressions of a culture in miniature. The public space is, of course, a place of great ritual. Lots of different rituals going on in public spaces all at the same time, but mostly we go there to see people or to be seen. So the architect's job then is to find the form that matches the ritual. And a job is considered a success if the architect can look at the ritual and come up with a new reading, which leads to a tweaking of the form or a revision of the form, which is in some way considered to be authentic. And it's only authentic if it can facilitate the ritual without in any way diminishing it. And if you look at the buildings that have interested you, or the architecture that you enjoy going back through time, I think you'll probably find that this is what's going on, that it's the celebration of ritual through form that makes the architecture.